Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to the Hindu Live. So we will discuss the ongoing confrontation between Iran and Israel today. So what I'm going to do is that I'll make some brief introductory remark and then we will open it up for Q&A so that we will have enough time. So just if you look at how we reached where we are today, the conflict began, of course, with the October 7 Hamas attack, and after which Israel launched its retaliatory war on Gaza, which has been going on for the last 1 year. But the conflict today is no longer between Israel and Gaza. It has now snowballed into a regional conflict involving many other actors, including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the Iranians. So, as of now, in the past 1 year, you have seen Iran launching two direct attacks against Israel. And Israel also continues to target Iranian IRGC generals and the Iranian proxies. Here, there are two fundamental problems that we have to keep in mind. One is that, uh, Iran continues to back these organizations, which the Iranians call the axis of resistance, including Hamas, Houthis, and Hezbollah, and Hashad al-Shabi. Whereas Israel sees them as Iranian proxies. So Israel is now fighting Hamas in Gaza. Israel is fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. But Israel's real target is Iran because Israel sees Iran as the patron of these organizations. That's why Israel took the war straight to Iran on April 1st in Damascus when the Israelis bombed the Iranian embassy. Iran responded at that time by launching its first direct military attack on Israel. But at that time, the Iranians took 14 days. They had also let the Americans know much in advance that an attack is coming, so that the United States could actually put together a coalition to shoot down the Iranian projectiles. But what happened after that? Iran showed some restraint, but this was not rewarding because Israel went on with its rampage. In July end, Israel killed Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas political chief, in an attack in Tehran. Iran promised retaliation, but it actually held its fire. It continued to show restraint. When Iran remained reluctant, Israel went with full force. So, in the last weeks of September, you saw Israel launching a massive attack against Hezbollah, dramatically escalating the conflict. It first targeted Hezbollah's ground level operatives through the pager explosions, walkie-talkie explosions, and then launched waves of airstrikes in Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah senior level commanders, and then eventually taking down the Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah. So after Nasrallah was killed, Iranians probably made a reassessment of their strategic restraint and realized that their policy did not stop Israel from going after its proxies. And if Iran did not respond, Israel will continue this attack against its proxies, and it would also undermine Iran's regional standing. This probably led to the Iranian leaders deciding to launch the ballistic attacks, which they did yesterday, October 1st. And this time the attack came quicker than in April. In April, there was this prior notice, 14-day gap, but this time, days after Hassan Nasrallah was killed, and on the same day, Israel launched a military incursion into Lebanon. Iran fired its missiles into Israel. So most of the missiles, the Israelis say, were intercepted, but at the same time, at least one Israeli airbase was hit, and then several Iranian missiles actually breached the Israeli, missile defense systems. So now that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promising to respond to the Iranian attack, uh, the conflict is set to escalate further, and the Iranians have already warned that they will respond with, crushing response to any Israeli retaliation. So this time is not going to be like April 2024. This time it looks, the crisis looks much more complicated and it is likely to escalate further. So yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. We will, go to the Q&A. So yeah, Arun Francis is asking what is the end game of the Israel-US game, which means this conflict. What is the purpose of all this larger scheme of things? See, I don't think that anybody has any idea about what would be the end game here, because if you look at the American policy, Biden adopted this unworkable policy, if you ask me, policy of giving Israel free hand in Gaza, while at the same time spending his diplomatic resources on preventing the conflict from escalating into a regional war. The United States did not want a direct war with Iran because the United States has other priorities, right? Because the United States continues to back Ukraine in Eastern Europe, the United States is also worried about China's rise in East Asia. So the US doesn't want to get stuck in West Asia in another conflict. So it doesn't want a direct confrontation with Iran. But at the same time, the United States, for some strange reasons, the Biden administration was not ready to use its diplomatic or other leverage on Israel to ruin Israel in Gaza. What Biden thought, or Tony Blinken thought, was that if Israel is allowed to continue the war in Gaza, and if the United States continue to spend its diplomatic resources on other actors in the region, they can actually prevent the conflict from widening. But the problem is that in Gaza, Israel went with full force. They killed 41,000 people in less than a year. And that will have consequences. And the consequences came from Hezbollah and others, Hezbollah and Houthis. And the common factor here is Iran. So this is actually a textbook case for escalation. Israel goes to Gaza after the Hamas attack in Israel, and there are immense, huge casualties in Gaza, and Hezbollah opens its so-called support front in Israel's north. It started firing rockets into Israel. And then Israel sees two challenges. One is, of course, Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon. So Israel goes after Hezbollah. Hezbollah says it will cease fire if Israel ceases fire in Gaza. But Israel was not ready to cease fire in Gaza. Why? Because you look at the Israeli leaders, they have two declared objectives. One is to destroy Hamas, and the second objective is to secure the release of hostages. It's been a year since the war began. No, Hamas hasn't been destroyed, and the hostages haven't been released yet, right? So Israel cannot bring the war in Gaza to an end unless it meets its objectives. It hasn't met its objectives. So unless Israel brings the war in Gaza to an end, Hezbollah won't stop firing rockets. So then what Israel did was to turn its focus towards Hezbollah. So then the war widens. So this is where Biden administration lost its plot. So right now, and once Hezbollah is involved, what Israel did was to take out its leadership. And if you kill Hassan Nasrallah, who was a central figure in Iran's forward defense doctrine, and Hezbollah is also a key constituent of Iran's axis of resistance. So when you kill Hassan Nasrallah, you obviously expect the Iranians to respond. So which means the crisis first widens and then it escalates. This is what is happening right now. So the end game is that what is a possible end game is a ceasefire. It has to start with a ceasefire in Gaza. But the Israelis are not ready to cease fire in Gaza. That is one thing. And then secondly, the crisis is now escalating because now the next step would be an Israeli strike on Iran. We don't know how wide or how deep that strike is going to be. It is expected to be a greater attack than what the Israelis did in April after the Iranian attack. In April, the Israelis carried out only a symbolic attack in Isfahan, taking out a radar system, which may not be the case this time, because even the Iranian attack, yesterday's Iranian attack, was huge in scope, and it actually breached the Israeli missile defense and hit at least some targets inside Israel. So, yes, now Benjamin Netanyahu is going to respond. So, what we have to see is how the Iranians are going to take it or what they are going to do. So, we are clearly on an escalatory ladder where the crisis is now spiraling out of control. And I don't think anybody has any end game in sight at this point of time. So, Rishank is asking if this escalates into a world war. Where do you think? So let's not go to the world war at this point of time, because the worst case scenario I foresee is a prolonged shooting match between the Israelis and the Iranians, with the pro-Iran proxies also participating in it. When I say pro-Iran organizations, that includes anyway Hezbollah, which is already fighting Israel, and Houthis, who are already firing rockets and missiles and drones into Israel. And Hamas is fighting the Israelis in Gaza. And then who could join this fight is Hashd al-Shabi, or what you call the Popular Mobilization Units in Syria and Iraq, who are also Shia militias that can also join the war. So you will see Iran on the one side and the pro-Iran militias on the other in the region, and Israel on the other. And if Iran continues to fire rockets, ballistic missiles, and hypersonic missiles into Israel, which means the United States could be dragged into the conflict, because the United States would not continue to sit on the fence if Israel comes under repeated barrage of attacks, right? So the worst case scenario is that you will have a protracted shooting match between these two sides, Israel on the one side supported by the United States, and Iran on the other side supported by the proxies. So this is a possibility. I don't know whether we would go to that level, but this looks like a possibility at this point of time. So this doesn't serve India's interests for two reasons. One, India has good ties with both the Israelis and the Iranians. Israel, you have strong defense partnership with the Israelis. You also have good political relationship between India's rulers and the Israeli Prime Minister. But at the same time, Iran is a strategically important country as regards India is concerned. India has invested in the Chabahar port, and recently, even after the last Israeli attack on Israel, India went ahead signing the Chabahar, development project agreement. So India, the message India was signaling at that time, when Ebrahim Raisi was still around, the former Iranian president, the message India was signaling at that time was that irrespective of the Iran-Israel confrontation, India was keen to develop its relationship with both partners, both the Israelis and the Iranians. So definitely so, and Iran is also, if you look at the geographically, Iran is important for us because it is the gateway to Central Asia, and especially when the South Transport Corridor is taking shape, Iran would play an important connecting point between India, Azerbaijan, and Russia. So geographically, Iran is important, and in terms of defense partnership, technological partnership, intelligence sharing, etc., Israel is also an important partner. So India would not take a side as usual, but at the same time, we would also continue to appeal to both sides to dial down the tensions, because a war is not in your interest. And the war is also taking place in a region where millions of Indians are working just across the Gulf from the Iranian coast. If the war spills over into the Gulf, then that would be disastrous for India, because millions of Indians are working there. And then secondly, this is an oil-rich region. If there is a protracted conflict, oil prices are going to go up. So that will also, India as a country that is dependent on imports to meet 80 plus percentage of its oil demand, it's not going to be a welcome news either. So you look at it from any point of view: bilateral relationship, economic security, personal security of Indians living in the region, a conflict in a wider conflict in West Asia is not going to be in India's interest. So yeah, the United States is helping Israel by providing ammunitions. What about the GDP of US? See, the United States, US has faced a lot of pressure in recent years, but at the same time, do not underestimate the capacity of the United States. It remains the world's most powerful country. It remains the world's most powerful military force. It remains the world's largest economy, irrespective of the economic challenges it faces. And Israel, as regards the United States, is concerned. There is a bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C. about when it comes to Israel or Israel's conflicts, right? Um, Irrespective of what Israel does, the United States is unlikely to give up on Israel, unlikely to abandon Israel, because Israel is more of a domestic political issue in Washington than a foreign policy issue. So whether it is Joe Biden or Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, whoever the president, there you are not going to see any dramatic change in the United States foreign policy towards Israel. But American presidents in the past had used pressure tactics to rein in Israel. For example, in 1982, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, President Reagan, who was a Republican president, who practically asked Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to wind down the conflict. He called it a Holocaust, the Israeli attack on the Lebanese people in 1980s. And then he put pressure on the Israelis and forced Israel to basically pull back from Beirut. And then Israel would continue to retain its military presence in southern Lebanon, which is in the Bekaa Valley region, where they would carve out a security zone, etc., etc. So this would set the stage for a prolonged fight between Hezbollah and Israel from 1982 to 2000. And in 2000, Israel, under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, was forced to withdraw from Lebanon, mainly because of Hezbollah's resistance. So this is what happened. So American presidents in the past had used basically pressure tactics to rein in Israel, but there won't be any fundamental change in America's policy towards Israel. And Biden is especially pro-Israeli president because, irrespective of what Biden said when he became president, he said human rights would take center stage of his foreign policy, etc., etc. But he did not use his leverage. He did not put pressure on Israel, in spite of the high humanitarian toll of Gaza, because 41,000 people were killed in Gaza, 100,000 people were wounded. Almost the entire population of Gaza Strip have been turned into refugees. That is 2.3 million people. But the United States did not move an inch. The United States continued to support Israel. The United States continued to provide weapons to Israel, because most of the weapons the Israelis are using, including the bomb they used to, the bunker busters they used to kill Hassan Nasrallah last week, were the US provided. The planes were provided by the jets, were US jets, US made jets. Intelligence is real-time intelligence is shared by the CIA. So it is because Israel continues to enjoy the support, unwavering support of the United States, Israel manages to do what it does in Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, and elsewhere in the region. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia, yes. See, the UAE has signed a normalization agreement with the Israelis, right? So this is what the Abraham Accords all about. So in 2020, the Emiratis signed the Abraham Accords, and the Abraham Accords still stands. Not just the Abraham Accords. all Israeli peace agreements with its neighboring, whether it is with Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, or Morocco. Forget about Sudan because Sudan is at war with itself. But you look at other countries, all the bilateral agreements are standing. Everybody is protesting. The Egyptians are unhappy, apparently. The Jordanian foreign minister is making statement. The Jordanian king Abdullah is also making statement, but nobody has touched the bilateral agreements, the normalization agreements with the Israelis. Not the Jordanians, not the Egyptians, not the Emiratis, not the Bahrainis. Everybody wants the status quo in their bilateral relationship to continue with the Israelis. That is one thing. So, and secondly, the Emiratis are clearly, they are not very fond of Hamas. They have made it clear. So they hardly criticize Israel, but they raised concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. But there is no threat to the normalization agreement between the UAE and the Israelis. Basically, there is no threat to the Abraham Accords. So the UAE has made it clear because the UAE sees Hamas as an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood, which the UAE sees as a major threat, internal security threat. Because the brothers are Republicans, they are political Islamists, the UAE doesn't like them. But the Saudis, there is an interesting, turn in the Saudi policy towards this question because if you recall, Saudi Crown Prince was in Delhi in September 2023, exactly a year ago, to attend the G20 summit. And he gave an interview to CNN in which he said that Saudi Arabia and Israel were making progress almost on a daily basis in normalizing the relationship between the two sides. So, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had earlier said in an interview to the Atlantic that Israel has a right to exist in the region. And then he compared Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, to Hitler. So it was very evident the Saudis saw the Iranians as their main rivals, and they were ready to, ready for a rapprochement with the Israelis. And the Biden administration, especially Tony Blinken, he was working very hard to make sure a Saudi Israeli normalization takes place. So this was basically the trump card of the Biden administration for peace in West Asia. But then October 7 happens, right? And Israel's invasion begins. The retaliatory war begins, and the war is still going on. And it is not practically possible for the Saudis, especially given the rage on the Arab Strait, to go ahead with the normalization agreement at this point of time. Because now you look at the Saudi statements issued by the foreign ministry, statements, also remarks made by the Crown Prince himself, Mohammed bin Salman himself, says that they say Saudi Arabia is still committed to normalizing ties with, or still committed to peace with Israel, but Saudi Arabia will sign a peace agreement with Israel, according to Mohammed bin Salman, only if there is a clear path towards a two-state solution or towards the creation of a Palestinian state based on the 1967 border, with East Jerusalem being its capital. So this is the so-called Abdullah plan laid out by the former monarch, King Abdullah, back in 2000. So now if you look at the remarks made by the Saudi Foreign Ministry or Mohammed bin Salman, he is endorsing the King Abdullah plan, which is also called the Arab Peace Initiative. So yes, the agreement between the Emiratis and the Israelis are still holding, but the Saudis and the Israelis were on the cusp of reaching an agreement that has collapsed, and that's not going to be revived anytime soon, which also means that the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which proposed to link India's western coast through, to the Gulf first through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and then across the Mediterranean Sea, southern Europe. So this is the plan. So if you look at the map, Saudi Arabia is the missing link. Saudi Arabia is the only country that doesn't have a formal diplomatic relationship with Israel. So unless there is a formal diplomatic relationship with Israel, the India-Middle East economic corridor is not going to take off. So the ongoing conflict in West Asia means that there won't be a normalization of relationship between the Saudis and the Israelis anytime soon, which also means that the India Middle East Economic Corridor will have to wait. Yeah, Arun is asking what will happen if Israel attacks Iran's nuclear facilities. See, if the question is whether China and Russia get involved in the conflict, no, I don't think so. Not at the current, not when we look at the conflict at its current level, because the Russians are already anyway, their hands are full. They are fighting a war in Ukraine, which is a prolonged conflict, and the Chinese hardly get themselves involved in conflict. But at the same time, we know that Iran shares close ties with both the Russians and the Chinese. So the Iranians might get support from the Russians, military support, because in Ukraine, the Iranians provided their kamikaze drones and maybe ballistic missiles, we don't know, or cruise missiles. There were all kind of reports about the Iranian assistance for the Russians, but definitely the Iranian drones were used by the Russians in the war in Ukraine. So it is possible that Russia could provide offensive weapons to Iran in the event of a wider conflict. But will there be a direct Russian involvement? I don't think so. And the Chinese could support economically. So will there be a military involvement by the Chinese? I don't think so. Because if you look at the whole crisis from China's point of view, the United States is pinned down in West Asia, what they call the Middle East, right? Whereas in East Asia, China keeps rising. So the United States identifies China as its most powerful systemic rival, but the United States focuses elsewhere in Eastern Europe and in West Asia today. So from China's point of view, I mean, it's okay. I mean, the conflict can go on. So China is making the right noises, of course, but I don't think they are going to make themselves involved in the conflict. But the Russians could help Iran militarily, but without directly, getting itself involved in the confrontation. So we don't know whether the IRGC and Pezeshkian are standing against each other. But what we know is that if you turn back, when Iran launched its previous attack in April, Ebrahim Raisi was the president. And in May, Ebrahim Raisi gets killed in the helicopter crash. And in June, and by June end, Iran holds a presidential election, and then Pezeshkian becomes the president. And on June 31st, on the inauguration of Pezeshkian as the president, Israel kills Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. And on the same day, Israel also killed Fouad Shukur. Fouad Shukur was a senior commander of Hezbollah. He was actually the man of Hezbollah's operations. He was a highly influential commander. Fouad Shukur was killed in an Israeli attack in Beirut first, and within hours, Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran. So on July 31st, within 24 hours, Israel has hit Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran in 2 strikes. This happened when Pezeshkian was the president. And IRGC had actually promised retaliation, but they did not retaliate. So there are many reports suggesting that after Ismail Haniyeh was killed, Pezeshkian actually advocated for restraint, and he also proposed a formula for Iran holding back fire in return for a ceasefire in Gaza. But there was no ceasefire in Gaza. Israel did not agree to a ceasefire in Gaza, but Iran still did not retaliate for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So many hardliners in Iran say that this actually emboldened Israel in the ongoing conflict, and Israel decided to go with full force against Hezbollah. So yes, so there were different approaches, because Pezeshkian, after the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, Pezeshkian chose restraint. But that position was undermined by Israel going after Hezbollah and killing Hassan Nasrallah. So when you kill someone like Hassan Nasrallah, who Iran saw as a central figure in its regional security architecture, Iran is bound to respond. So the position of restraint, strategic restraint, the argument for strategic restraint was basically undermined by Israel's attacks on Hezbollah, and Iran then decides to launch its second direct attack on Israel on October 1st. This is how it happened. So, IRGC and Pezeshkian may not be against each other, but there were different approaches earlier. But now you see Pezeshkian had defended Iran's strike. No, yesterday he had tweeted saying that Iran has a right to defend itself. This is the slogan which the Western governments always say about Israel. All the Western leaders, they will say that I support Israel's right to defend itself. So Pezeshkian was basically, it was a play on this slogan. And then Pezeshkian was saying, and also defending Iranian action, saying that Iran has a right to defend itself. Does Iran have any ally, outside the Shia militias? Yes, in a sense, Syria is an Iranian ally. But Syria, we know, is yet to recover from the impacts of the civil war. The state has taken a huge toll during the civil war from 2011 onwards. And you can say that Russia is also an Iranian ally. In a sense, they have a deep strategic cooperation between the Russians and the Iranians, and which became stronger after the Ukraine war broke out. Besides Syria, Iran doesn't have any state allies in West Asia. But Iran has non-state allies, which includes both Shia and Sunni militias, not just Shia militias, predominantly Shia militias, because Hashad al-Shabi of Iraq is a Shia militia. Houthis are Shiites. They are Zaidi Shiites. And then you have Hezbollah is an Arab Shia movement. But then Hamas and Islamic Jihad are Sunni, predominantly Sunni. So all these make up Iran's so-called axis of resistance. And then Syria is a state ally, and the Iranians played a crucial role in turning around the civil war in Syria, along with the Russians and Hezbollah. They played a crucial role. So Assad is actually grateful to the Iranian involvement in Syria to turn around the civil war. And Iran has sizable influence in Iraq. Iraq, you have a Shia government, but at the same time in Iraq, the political situation is much more complicated because you have thousands of American troops present in Iraq. And the United States can continue to bomb Iraq at its will, and it had done it in the past. So the Iraqi government, though it has close ties with the Iranians, would not like to cross the red line, angering the Americans, though they will continue to do a balancing act between Iran and the Americans. So this is the regional situation. Iran's allies are predominantly the non-state actors in the region. So why did the UK intercept? It is easy. The Americans decided to intercept the missiles. So the UK always plays along, right? Because whatever DC decides, London follows. It's as simple as that. So in April, when Iran launched the missile attack, the United States put together a coalition. Americans, the British, the French, the Jordanians, and the Israelis. They all came together and they set up a defensive coalition that, shot down Iranian projectiles. The UK is a participant of America's Operation Prosperity Guardian or whatever. They've been attacking the Houthis of Yemen for almost a year now, right? And the UK is a party to that coalition. And the Americans had said before Iran launched the attack that the United States would join Israeli interceptors to shoot down the Iranian missiles. And once the Americans decide to do that, the British also come along. They do this. And the Russian participation, I don't know, I'm not aware of the involvement of the Russians, even technological involvement of the Russians in the resistance. But there were reports even in Western press, Wall Street Journal, that one of the options President Putin has, if the United States allowed the Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia using American and British weapons, ATACMS and Storm Shadow. So they have already supplied weapons, right? They are long-range missiles, but the Americans are basically ruining in Ukraine. Ukraine can hit the border region, but not deep inside Russia. But when Zelensky visited Washington, if you recall, there was much hype in the U.S. press that Zelensky was putting pressure on the Americans to allow him to use ATACMS and the Storm Shadows, but the United States did not give permission as of now. So there were reports that if the United States did, President Putin had warned that he would respond if the United States did this. And one of the options the Russians had was to transfer highly advanced missile technology to the Houthis through the Iranians. So we don't know whether the Russians are already involved. I guess they are not. But definitely, if the conflict goes on and if Russia decides to strengthen its relationship with the militia groups, it can do this. It can do it. I would say it's a conflict for land. It depends on how you look at it. I would say that even if Israel and it's now a conflict for land, because yes, Israel, when it comes to Israel, religion plays a major role because Israel is a Jewish state. It's a country created for the Jewish people in 1948 in historical Palestine. So religion is always an important factor here. But if you overlook this basic factor, I mean, when you talk about the creation of Israel, etc., or Israel's character, Israel calls itself a country for the Jewish people, right? A state for the Jewish people. So religion plays an important role. But right now, it is basically about land. It is not about religion because Palestinian Arabs are not just Muslims. Palestinian Arabs are Muslims as well as Christians. And what Israel wants is that Israel doesn't want to leave the West Bank. Israel doesn't want to pull back the settlers from the West Bank. There are now 700,000 settlers in the West Bank, right? And Israel doesn't want to give up on Jerusalem. Israel doesn't want to allow the refugees who were displaced in 1948 to come back to Israel proper, to the land or the regions now controlled by Israel citizens. So land, I think, is the most important factor here because Israel, as you know, is perhaps the only country in the world that doesn't have a clearly demarcated border. And Benjamin Netanyahu at the UN had produced the map of the whole of historical Palestine that includes West Bank and Gaza Strip as state of Israel. So this quest for a greater Israel is always been there in Israel, and especially when it comes to Israel's right wing and far right, they continue to push for this idea of greater Israel. So which means they want the whole of historical Palestine. Here, land, I think, is the most important thing. So I'll take this as the last question. What will be the role of the UN peacekeeping force? See, UN peacekeeping force is there in Yemen, in Lebanon, but they did little in preventing the conflict. They couldn't push the Hezbollah out of the southern region. They are not able to prevent Israel from carrying out another invasion. And when it comes to the UN's roles, I always say this. Whenever there is a conflict, many people say that the UN became irrelevant. When it comes to conflicts, the UN's role is always limited, especially if there are conflicts involving great powers. In the case of Israel Palestine, there are no great powers involved, but Israel is an ally of the United States. And the United States is the world's most powerful country. The United States has a veto power in the UN Security Council. So the United States would not let any resolution that are fundamentally critical of Israel pass through the resolution. Okay, mildly critical resolutions would be allowed to pass, but not major ones. So the United States actually offers political, diplomatic support for Israel. So and military support for Israel. When you have that kind of a country, the UN becomes paralyzed. UN actually makes a lot of noises, but the UN cannot do anything. So whether it is the UN peacekeeping missions or UN as an institution, when it comes to conflict resolution, its roles are limited. And you have a UN peacekeeping mission in Lebanon, but you do not have a UN peacekeeping mission in West Bank or Gaza. Israel will not let that happen. Israel will never accept UN peacekeeping mission in the West Bank or Gaza. Israel has an issue even with the UN Refugee Agency. Israel calls it terror sympathizer, etc., etc. So Israel is never going to accept a UN peacekeeping mission in Gaza, right? So but the fundamental point here is that when you have great powers, or when you have strong allies of great powers involved in a conflict, here in the case Israel, which is an ally of the United States, the UN's role is always limited. So we will wrap it up here. Thank you very much for joining me, and thanks for all your questions. Maybe after a few days we will revisit West Asia once again. Thank you very much.